Live event. Hello and welcome. We are so thankful that you are joining us today for E&E's webinar with Verse and Verdantix. My name is Jessica Hunt, and I am one of the co-owners of E&E Leader. Today's topic, it's an industry analyst perspective, closing the PPA management gap. Now, we're going to go over a few housekeeping items before I turn the presentation over to Ryan and to Sam. This event is being recorded. Please don't feel like you have to take notes. Be fully engaged in the conversation. Ask as many questions as you would like during the next 45 minutes or so. We will be having time at the end, time permitting, if to go over some of the questions from today's attendees. If we do not get a chance to answer your specific question, though, before we conclude today's event, the speakers will follow up with you as soon as possible. A question that we always get during the events is, are the attendees going to receive a copy of the slide deck? The answer is yes. Verse will be following up with all attendees and registrants after today's live event, and will provide a copy of the deck. No question should not be asked during the next 45 minutes. We are going to start, though, with a very basic opening poll question, which is, please share a few pieces of information you hope to get out of today's event, and please feel free to share any questions you have as well. This will help us as we move through today's discussion. I am going to jump off and rejoin you for the end of the event because you are here to listen to Ryan and Sam and not to me. So I'll be on the back end. Let us know in the comments where you're joining from, and we look forward to an interactive event today. Thank you, Sam and Ryan, for being here.
Jessica, thanks so much for having us. It's really great to be back on an E&E Leader webinar. I'm Sam Cotterall, Director of Client Enablement at Verse. I'm going to kick us off because I'll be handing it over to Ryan with Verdantix and then popping in at the end. But Jessica challenged us to not read our LinkedIn resumes to you, but rather give you something fun to think about, maybe personal, aside from the webinar content or our background. So I live in Colorado, and that's not my fun fact, but this is the third year in a row that I've managed to ski 50 or more days in a ski season, which is hard to do with a full-time job, but yeah, you have to be a real weekend warrior. I would say that the reason I chose this fun fact is that this year was the worst snowfall year on record in Colorado. And despite having this fun fact not be related to renewable energy, I wanted to circle it back in and say, one of the reasons that I get up every day and want to work towards renewables and a cleaner future is so that I can keep skiing and that my children and their children can keep skiing. So with that, I'll pass it over to Ryan and let him take over.
That is a great mission, Sam. Thank you. Thank you to Sam. Thank you to Verse. Thank you, Jessica. And thank you, E&E Leader. My name is Ryan Skinner. I am a research director here at Verdantix. Verdantix is a global research and advisory firm focusing on topics around sustainability, industrial optimization, EHS, and decarbonization topics. My team works on topics that relate to energy transition specifically. So we do a lot of research around renewable energy procurement, EV charging, and a long list of topics. My fun fact, I guess, is that I speak Norwegian fluently, despite the fact that I'm not Norwegian. I'm actually an American who lives in the UK, and I just happen to speak Norwegian fluently. So if you speak Norwegian, I'd be happy to have a conversation with you. Without further ado, let me dive into some the content here. So if you just hang with me one second while I get the content going. Get slides started here. Just 1 minute.
Ryan, I got to watch a World Cup matchup in Norway, in Oslo. So I didn't speak any Norwegian, but it was awesome to see how fluent in English everyone in the Scandinavian region is.
It is not easy to learn Norwegian there because everybody wants to speak English to you.
I
It's
wasn't
true.
even trying. I don't think my mouth can make those sounds. So hats off.
Yeah. You probably paid a lot for your beers too. That's another
I sure
fun
did.
fact
Yeah.
about Norway. Great. So let me talk a little bit about closing the PPA management gap. So this talk is really for you who work in a corporate, for example, procurement or energy or sustainability or operations role, and you're thinking through your energy strategy. So I think we really have something valuable to help you in this talk. I'm going to start off by positing a situation that you're probably all familiar with, like a situation where things you're having to relate to on a regular basis are steadily getting worse and you're noticing it. So classic example is, for example, your car. Your car is starting to show signs of age, or you have a favorite jumper and it's starting to fray a little bit. And here I've shown an example of a road that's slowly starting to break up due to all the seasons and the potholes. And in this situation, you know also that there are things that are going to speed that up and make it even worse and worse. And you know you should probably do something about it. For example, that road that is, through this winter only going to get worse and worse. And you need to talk to your local mayor and actually get that road fixed. Otherwise, you're going to be driving like this pretty soon in that road. There's a lot of situations and very specific situations within the energy environment, the energy space, that where this metaphor applies very much. That is, that there are problems that we're starting to see are starting to feel a little bit painful, and we know they're only going to get worse and worse. And specifically around, in this instance, what we'll be talking about is renewable energy procurement in particular. So this talk is going to help you avoid that problem. So I'm going to talk through a few key points. I'm going to start off by setting the stage and describing what we're seeing from our research at Verdantix in the market. Then we're going to identify and describe the particular problem that we're seeing that we expect to see bite many people soon enough. Then I'll talk briefly through ways that firms are looking to address this problem. And then finally, I'll talk about a few specific things that you can do to help address it. So our research and where this perspective is coming from is based upon a pretty extensive amount of research that we do. We do specific to the buy side, that is the corporate side, demand side of energy. We do a survey of over 300 energy leaders every year, and we'll be sharing some data from that survey. We do research into the corporate energy transition solution space, the digital grid tech space, and quite explicitly, late last year, we did a deep dive into renewable energy procurement vendors. And all of that helps inform the insights that I'm going to be sharing with you right now. First of all, what do we see in general in as far as trends in the energy landscape in this particular year? So there's a lot of things that are priorities for corporate energy leaders. First and foremost, energy price volatility. So this is, of course, very prescient and pressing right now, given political activities and what we're seeing happen in the Middle East. So, and we've seen this historically through a series of geopolitical activities, as well as just general market pressures. So energy price volatility is a pretty significant issue impacting that landscape. Grid constraints and instability. So this obviously varies radically from market to market, but we're seeing dramatic examples of, for example, blackouts in the Iberian Peninsula last year, as well as significant grid constraints seen in the US. So each market is facing some particular challenges there and pushing their local utilities to move faster, especially, for example, around interconnection queues. Energy resilience and security is a major topic that we're seeing. Businesses are concerned about what the issue around power quality, power supply, power sourcing mean for their business. And decarbonization has been a major issue. As most businesses, though, oftentimes are starting to not talk as much about their net zero targets, still have, for example, green bonds that they're having to live up to, and decarbonization initiatives that they need to actually continue investing in and pushing forward because they recognize that the market's going to keep going in that direction. And finally, having to meet mandates and building standards, especially around, for example, real estate investors. Broadly speaking, When we asked energy leaders to what degree their CEOs or C-suites were speeding up their energy transition versus slowing it down, 66% said we're speeding up our energy transition. Only 5% said they're slowing it down. So obviously, we're seeing some pretty significant shifts, and this is leading to very specific kinds of decisions. So when we ask businesses, again, in this instance, we talk to sustainability leaders, how important particular activities were to them around decarbonization in the coming 12 months. We gave them a number of different responses, but the one related to increasing procurement of renewable energy came out near the top. So 55% of respondents said this is going to be very important for us in the coming 12 months. And more than 80% said this is going to be important for us as a business. So renewable energy procurement is certainly high on the agenda for a lot of these businesses. And then when you look at it more broadly in terms of the overall market developments, well, we're seeing rises in purchase volumes and rises in purchase intent. So the two are going together hand in hand. In fact, if you look at Bloomberg NEF's year-on-year additional contracted gigawatt capacity for corporate PPAs specifically, looking back almost 10 years, what you see here is a pretty dramatic and steady growth. And what you see in terms of the actual incremental additions is something around half of the UK's annual electricity consumption per year being added in corporate PPA volumes. So that the overall market is growing pretty significantly. From our own questioning of sustainability leaders, the average firm expects to increase their spend on offsite renewables by around 34% from 2026 to 2030. And you see this in a lot of specific examples. Obviously, in the data center space, you see a lot of PPA activity. Recently, Google and Total Energies did a deal to power Ohio data centers. But you're also seeing it in a lot of totally non-IT or data center related contexts. For example, Rio Tinto signed a 15-year deal for its US mining operations as a corporate PPA. And Network Rail here in the UK, where I'm based, signed a PPA for about 300 gigawatt hours of offshore wind. What the summary is here is renewable energy deals are only growing. There's more spend going into them and more deals. So there's a lot of momentum going into that market. So if we're still thinking of that road, there's a lot more traffic that's going to be hitting that road. So far, so good. We're seeing this happen. But as with all things, the more activity that happens with it, the more problems creep in. And the more aware people are of these problems, and this is where I start talking directly to you, dear webinar attendee, in a way that we're going to hope to help you, is the more you are aware of it and the more you're going to take advantage and get ahead of some of these problems, it's going to give you competitive advantage, and it's going to lead to you being more prepared to deal with things as they come up. So what is changing? What are the nature of these problems? Well, there's more and more PPAs, for example, for each particular business. So many businesses now are signing multiple PPAs and are having to manage a whole portfolio of PPAs at the same time. And each of those PPAs involves a distinct counterparty, involves having to stay on top of performance profiles and data streams. There are simply more complex deals with more discrete conditions to stay on top of. So as well as just across more and more geographies. And this inherent challenge of PPAs growing in volume and complexity is leading to a very specific outcome in terms of a response on the part of energy leaders. So when we asked in a very recent survey of 350 energy leaders done earlier this year, how likely are you to redevelop your approach to procuring renewable energy in the next 2 years? 40% said we're highly likely to be changing how we do that. And 40% said somewhat likely. So there is on the part of the market a desire to think afresh about this. And Scope 2 changes are underway. Already the working group for Scope 2 has mooted a number of different changes that are going to lead to more specific geographic reporting, hourly accounting, something along the lines of a 24/7 mandate, as well as the use of residual mix factors. What this does is, again, further complicate procurement and ongoing management and recognition, for example, of EACs, and puts more burden, again, on businesses to address this. When we specifically ask corporate leaders on the energy side, which challenges most limit your ability to procure renewable energy, here you can see we gave an option to select one number one challenge and then significant or minor challenges. Among the top ones for number one challenge was uncertain or changing regulatory requirements. So changes in terms of what governments are asking of them. Limited availability of high quality supply in the required geographies. So already they're thinking ahead vis-a-vis some of those scope 2 expectations, or what's being required of groups like RE100 and so on and so forth. As well as internal lack of expertise with PPAs, so inside the business. They're basically feeling generally challenged. All of this leads to big questions within many businesses. For example, a question that we heard when talking to a major CEO of business who had worked on PPAs, why did we make money on our PPA? So a lot of these complex ongoing contracts and uncertain operations are leading to big questions like this that need to be answered. Well, let's break down where things go wrong as all of these problems start to come to bear. So I'm going to share this metaphor. So we talked about a road. So imagine this road is going off across a bridge. And the start of your bridge, the start of your journey, you're starting a PPA process. At the end of the journey, at the distant end of that bridge, you can see some beautiful landscape, which is PPA bliss. But first, you got to get over that bridge. And so there's a number of different pillars that are going to support you in getting across that bridge, from before you've even started to having and being very happy with your PPA portfolio. These are these 7 steps: renewable energy opportunity assessment, deal sourcing, contracting, negotiating, and deal signing, your pre-COD waiting period, the contract performance adherence, forecasting future performance, and EEC management or EAC management. So these are your kind of 7 major steps from starting that process to getting to PPA bliss. Okay. Now, here's the issue. As it stands today, the steps up to and including signing are very well supported in the market. The steps after that are not nearly as well supported. For example, in the commercial operation date, pre-commercial operation date waiting period, you could be issues around delays, supply chain issues, interconnection, permitting, so on and so forth. There are not a lot of great solutions or capabilities on the market to help you as a corporate energy leader to stay on top of that, especially, again, when looking at multiple PPAs. Same goes for contract performance adherence. It's almost as if you have all these things lined up for you until you get to the point of signing, and then you're on your own. And the potential losses, especially looking across multiple PPAs, is in the millions. And we saw that from a few clients that we spoke with. So this all calls to mind an image, right? Something along these lines, right? So I don't know about you, but going into a process, a highly important financial process that would demand kind of ongoing awareness and understanding and management, you'd want to be insured all the way, as opposed to what you might consider in this bridge, you're careening over the bridge without the support that you'd like to have. So going back to the road I was talking about, who's at the wheel? Who's responsible for this? Well, there's a lot of different parties working on this kind of thing within the typical enterprise, but they have somewhat conflicting priorities. So which department leads in making your firm's major energy procurement decisions? What we found when we surveyed corporate energy leaders was that around almost half of them said like a dedicated energy or procurement group was responsible for it. We also saw operations, about 1 in 5 said our operations team is responsible for it. Around a little over a quarter said sustainability. But each of these is pulled in specific different directions. Energy teams are oftentimes driven very much by cost, security supply, and the cost at the time of purchase. Sustainability teams are thinking very much about decarbonization and wanting to secure and ensure they have the appropriate coverage for their, for example, net zero targets or at least their decarbonization commitments. And then the operations team is wanting to ensure predictability. So we've seen that there's this significant problem. We're on this road. We know it's going to get even busier and more crumbled. And it turns out that it's not terribly well supported after the point of signing. How do we address this? What's currently in place to help us as a business to address this particular challenge? Well, let me walk through your options then. So first of all, you have the basic, right? Spreadsheets. It's a good starting point for a single particular deal. So you sign one PPA agreement, and you're going to be able to do quite a bit with just your basic office tools and the supplies you get. There are issues when you start getting into version control. You're not going to have real-time data, which is going to create, even at in that context, some limitations. But that doesn't, once you get beyond a single PPA agreement, for example, you're going to be very, very hamstrung, and you're not going to be able to manage that bridge after you get halfway across it. You also have sustainability software platforms. These are very good for reporting. They're not very good for asset performance. They're not set up to help understand how these things are behaving over time. So there's some particular challenges there. Services are good for example, point-in-time assessments, but not continuous. So you're not going to be able to understand how, for example, a particular solar array is generating energy on an ongoing basis in a particular geography using services, because they will typically come in and make a particular assessment at a point of time. So there's issues around getting and managing ongoing generation data, price exposure, EAC positions, and invoice accuracy, which should be changing hourly. Your services partner isn't going to be able to help you stay on top of it. And then you sometimes have dedicated tools for renewable energy procurement. But again, those are very front-loaded. They're very much currently in the market designed to help address everything up to the point of signing. So when you look at these four options across some of the key parts of managing a PPA portfolio, you see that each of them has particular strengths and weaknesses. But particularly as it gets to, for example, live performance, EEAC management, continuous data, they're all starting to see some particular challenges. None of these are particularly set up to address it. But when we were talking to Verse and looking at their technology within our research, we saw that it seemed designed to address a lot of these challenges of PPA management post-purchase on an ongoing basis. So some of the things that we saw as examples from the world of, as I said, PPA bliss, is the ability to go and think about invoice review as financial recovery. So the ability to identify billing errors and generation shortfalls in terms of actuals and not potentials, what actually happened with those assets. The ability to reconcile buyer and developer on performance. So oftentimes the developer will have perfect insight into what's going on. But with that, if you have SCADA and telemetry to be able to close that information gap, you're going to become much closer to having a high fidelity relationship, the same view basically as your developer. So we spoke with one developer's error rate for annual accruals was at 86%. So huge amounts of errors. Buyers need to be able to stay on top of that, and they can do that. In addition, you're going to be able to want to answer some very hard questions. For example, a CEO might say, hey, we're having a price spike in a particular market. Why aren't we benefiting from it? Why is this not working for us? In one particular example, we heard that there was low generation from the wind fleet, which helped explain why that was happening and validated that the portfolio wasn't necessarily failing them in that context. The ability to track EAC positions. So, for example, many buyers are going to find that if they're have a shortfall of EAC at the end of the year when they're expensive, they're going to be facing high cost. Whereas if they've been aware of that 6 months previous, then they would have been able to make a move and make a significant savings there. And finally, just being able to increase their operational speed and make decisions when they matter as it relates to price spikes. And and so on and so forth. So finally, what do you do? Based upon everything that I've walked through, how do you know if this is relevant for you? What are your next steps? So we developed, as part of some research that we did together with Verse, kind of 5 yes/no questions. And if you can answer an unequivocal yes to these, then you're in a good position. If you can't, then you're going to need to reconsider your position and reconsider your approach to PPA management. The first question: if your developer sent you an invoice tomorrow, could you verify it against an independently modeled generation baseline before approving it? Yes or no? If one of your assets underperformed by 20% last month, would your team know today rather than a settlement? Yes or no? When you see a variance, can you attribute it to resource curtailment, equipment failure, or market mechanics? Yes or no? Again. The fourth question: if your CFO, sustainability lead, and energy manager each polled last quarter's portfolio performance right now, would they see the same number? Yes or no? And finally, are your forecast assumptions behind your portfolio financials current? Yes or no? Many businesses, I think, are going to find that they cannot answer yes to these questions. Though, as you can see, a lot of these yes/no questions tie back to some of those problems or opportunities, depending how you want to see it, that we talk through when we talk through PPA management. So this will help you determine whether this is relevant for you. Your next steps is kind of a 2-part here dance, going from internal to external. So first, you're going to want to look at those questions that you weren't able to answer well. Think through who owns the problem, agreeing on a baseline, and then establishing a potential value of unrecovered errors or consultant fees. Then turning externally and starting to think through the different capabilities out in the market to help support you, starting to pilot some different offerings, and thinking through scale as that applies to you. So these are all on the solution side. So this is the pathway to the future. This is our clear road towards PPA bliss, provided you manage it well. And I believe, my intent with this presentation was to help ensure that you are better off the back of it and not worse, despite what we see happening in the energy market. And with that, I will pause and hand off to Sam. So I'll stop sharing my presentation there, and hopefully, Sam, you can jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. First and foremost, just want to say we really appreciated the work that Verdantix put together, which is why we're teaming up today. But I also wanted to point out that the presentation that Ryan shared today is based on a much longer form report that goes into much greater detail. So definitely encourage everyone on the line to check that out as well. So yeah, I'm Sam. As I mentioned at the top of the call, I'm with Verse. I skipped the Verse intro because I knew I had this coming up, but we are an SF-based energy platform startup. We are our co-founders, Matt and Syed, those handsome gentlemen on the top left there, worked on the sell side of energy for a very long time and realized that, your developers, IPPs, utilities have a lot of tools that are purpose-built for them that help them with managing their core business, which is energy. What they also realized was that corporate buyers, a major part of why the sell side exists, didn't have access to the same tools. A lot of the work, as Ryan mentioned, was being done in spreadsheets or through services by consultants. So they created the technology stack for large energy buyers. Going into a question that we got in the chat, we're talking about PPA portfolios pretty specifically in first the Verdantix report, but also on this webinar. But we can't just view energy from a renewable energy procurement silo. There's a lot that goes into it. Today, we are talking about those PPA portfolios, which Verse manages through an app called Portfolio Insights. But it is really important to put that supply side of your energy portfolio in context with the rest of it. So, understanding your costs, your load, how many kilowatt hours, megawatt hours you're consuming, from the site level up to the global portfolio level. Our assertion here is by understanding your supply and your demand, you can then take action. You can manage that risk. whether it's market exposure, being short or long in wholesale markets, thinking about constructing a hedge portfolio, or controlling assets. So behind the meter assets, I think particularly interested in battery energy storage systems. Now, one of the reasons that we're starting with the portfolio insights piece is that this all comes back to the reason we're signing these long-term renewable energy agreements in the first place, which is EAC management. So again, to the question in the chat, no, you should not be thinking about this in a silo. You shouldn't be thinking about this, as a one PPA spreadsheet or even your PPA portfolio just by itself. You should think about it comprehensively across, all your sites, your load and supply agreements, any sort of, standard market-based tools that you can use to manage that risk, or things that you can do proactively on a site or portfolio level. So with that, we're not going to be able to, with the time we have today, get into every pillar holding the bridge up. But I did want to address some of what Ryan specifically and Verdantix talked about in their report, which is the second half of this bridge. And I want to start by diving into that yellow Lego piece. I don't know if I can use those trademarks on this, but the building block that is portfolio insights. So when Verse thinks about portfolio insights, this is going to be your VPPA, your PPA, your green tariff portfolios, the supply side of renewable energy. We want to be able to provide it all, and or we hear that you want to be able to see it all in one place. So that's what we do. We have we're able to bring in all of those contracts globally into a single pane of glass, if you will. We aren't going to get into it in depth today because I have spoken about it on previous webinars, but forecasting and accruals, invoice validation, incredibly important. What I am going to talk about today in greater detail is the contract adherence piece. I think Ryan did a very good job of outlining what that problem is. Teams spend an enormous amount of energy and no pun intended, effort on negotiating contracts. Some of these negotiations, the quick negotiations might be 6 months for a long-term power purchase agreement, while some may drag on multiple years. And the reason for that is there's a lot of back and forth on the terms that go into that contract. And what we've seen is a lot of companies kind of forget about the nuance of some of those terms and the impacts on the value of that contract to their company. So I'm gonna talk about that today. Also, I want to talk about pre-COD. So this is that middle pillar on the bridge, the keystone, if you will. But we've found in working with a lot of energy buyers that this can be a bit of a blind spot. You work really hard, with a developer 8760, a fundamental forecast to do a 12 or 15-year net present value, to think about implied rec value, or EACs, depending on what market you're in. But then there's this construction period that can take quite some time. And over that period of time, the world changes, whether it's fundamental forecasts, whether it's geopolitical issues that Ryan also mentioned. But the world looks very different from when you sign that contract to when it comes online. So I'm going to talk about how Verse addresses that. And that is by going into our pre-COD framework. So what we do is we'll create an actual digital twin of your asset. So when you sign that contract, where it's located, the capacity of the equipment, the makes and models of the equipment. We can use all of that information in the Verse RA platform to model what generation would look like, using locational weather data to understand not just the production or assumed production if you're building off of an 8760, but also to create these dummy settlements by matching that with generation weighted revenues from real market prices. The other thing that we're going to do is continually update that forecast. So we're actually producing a weekly forecast for these assets. And while some might say, well, that's pretty, I'm going to steal a term from Ryan that I really liked, high fidelity. Well, yeah, the world changes. As we've seen, the strait is open, the strait is closed. Having an up-to-date view on how that impacts your portfolio of PPAs or those that are yet to come online is really important. So what can we do with that digital twin? Well, not only can we keep you up to date on how the asset would be performing if it was online, but it gives us a lot of data to start training models so that we're ready on day one to do accruals. Once it's actually generating energy, so that's not a problem. But also then help you update that first year budget. So we can help your teams, again, whether it's procurement, finance, sustainability, understand the seasonality, the inherent risk profile of an intermittent resource, and communicate that across the organization. So for us, what does that look like? This is a case study. This is a client who had a COD pushed back. So rather than capturing the high value ERCOT summer months, this asset unfortunately came on a little later, and it totally blew up their first year budget. So by not having an updated view of where when this asset was coming online and how it could impact the revenues, that first year budget was in jeopardy. So moving on from that, and we can definitely talk more about that if anyone wants to reach out. But I'm looking at the clock, and I do want to leave some time for questions. I want to speak to the contract adherence piece. So again, Ryan did a really good job outlining this. We negotiate these terms. Let's see them through to the end. This is a long-term agreement, and it does have consequences. So what we're really excited to do is, use our ability to model the performance of the asset if we're not connected to the SCADA and telemetry data. So Ryan mentioned, having that real-time or near real-time view of asset performance. Something we're really excited about at Verse is to be able to connect to those data historian platforms, to be able to update generation meter data, market prices, set points, weather data, all from the actual sensors on site that are collecting the data. And that really gives clients or off-takers in general the ability to be proactive, not to wait for example, an annual or once every 2 year availability report to see, oh shoot, we were out, or even a monthly settlement to reconcile where we're landing at the end of the month. Having the real data from the asset just gives that speed to insights that is really important in being a proactive contract manager rather than an invoice payer. What you're seeing on your screen is actually a pretty cool example. This is a snowfall on a solar array, where the contract, knowing that this array was in a very snowy area, Alberta, Canada, in this instance, had a clause about removing snow after a certain amount of time following the last snowfall. And as you can see in the purple box here on the top, there was a ton of solar resource availability and not a lot of generation, which means that the operator of this asset did not get out there to clear panels as the contract stipulated. It happened to occur during very high priced environment, and this actually led to significant liquidated damages owed to the off-taker of this agreement. So that's one piece of this. But the other is, again, the reason we're signing these agreements in the first place, looking across a portfolio of assets, underperformance adds up. We're in this for, in this case, this is a North American portfolio, so RECs, and understanding that the generation shortfalls equate to you receiving fewer RECs is really important. And it's fun to work through some of the contractual terms that can make sure that replacement RECs are due to you, or that performance-based guarantees are set up rather than mechanical availability to ensure that production of an energy asset, the reason it's being put on built in the first place, is up to expectations. So building on the EAC piece, Ryan mentioned that there are sustainability platforms that are purpose built for kind of that downstream reporting. But having everything in a single tech stack, we think is really important. So wanted to just speak quickly before we get into Q&A on the tracking of those RECs. So from what's in your account to renewable energy that has been generated, but RECs not yet transferred, to give you an idea of where you are year to date in that REC accumulation or EAC accumulation here. Understand the generation shortfall and if there are replacement RECs due as a result of that, and building on that to say, okay, we understand where we are year to date from RECs in our account, RECs that have been accrued, and then building in the forecast. So, not using just a P50 8760, but using actually a machine learning approach and weather-driven approach to understanding what expectations are for the rest of the year to give you as Ryan mentioned, proactive, the ability to take a proactive approach to, filling a gap or potentially, dealing with a surplus of environmental attributes. Again, I think we have a few minutes left here, so I'm gonna bring it back to questions. Jessica's indicating that there are some in the chat here, among others. So among other places. So yeah.
And thank you to those who did submit questions. Again, we've had some people reach out asking for contact information for Ryan and Sam. So that can all be provided in the follow-up email as well. This is a problem that I know I've talked to other clients about, and we've actually covered it. So long-term contracts are frequently impacted by evolving electricity markets. So can you give us some examples of how contracts can be adapted based on, the current market conditions as well as the data that the clients are able to visually see as you've been showing us?
Yeah, I'll take the first stab at that, Ryan. So I think the question is, what can we do? We have a contract. What can we do? I think there are a couple of things. One is learning from the performance data. So if you are going to go either into a new market or back to the RFP process for additional, procurement, understanding what worked and what didn't from your existing portfolio is incredibly important. We spent a ton of time negotiating about tenths of a percent in mechanical availability. Did it pay off? Did we see any liquidated damages from that? Yes or no? It depends on your project and your contract. But to be able to quantify, oh, that $0 price floor that they didn't want to give us, or those basis differential intervals that we limited or capped at X hours, we saved Y amount of money this year. So not necessarily, I gave you the example of actually using performance data to pursue liquidated damages. I think, and I could go into additional examples of that, but I think another really important thing to consider is using the performance data of your existing contracts to understand what is good, what is working for us, what is buyer friendly, if you will, and putting that into new procurement contracts, and really feeding the origination side with performance data.
Excellent. And Ryan, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, we haven't done any research specific to that, so I think
Okay.
Sam's response is great.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Well, I think we're going to do maybe one more question because this event was scheduled to be about 45 minutes today. So following up, because I found this very interesting, following up on the contract adherence case study, what are some of the most significant financial or operational wins your clients have realized by tightening up their contract adherence during the settlement phase?
I think that one's probably directed at me.
Yes. Sorry, I should have said
no
Sam.
worries. Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess maybe there's some survey results from that, but I'll start. I would say that one of the biggest things to come out of this is, that I've seen is kind of rethinking an industry standard around mechanical availability. So I touched on that in my last answer, but I'm going to double down on it. Production-based guarantees are beginning to be the new normal, because the incentives can align for both the developer and the off-taker. And why are we thinking about an inverter is online, therefore my project is good, when we should be thinking about is my project generating energy like it's supposed to, therefore it is good. So I think quantifying the difference from a buyer's perspective in, what can a production-based guarantee do for me compared to a mechanical availability-based guarantee is something that, I think we're working with clients that have those in their agreements, and we're certainly working with clients who are putting those in their new agreements. And I think that is one of the big things that comes out of this contract adherence and portfolio performance monitoring that sticks out to me.
Excellent. And then, Ryan, I know I said one last question, but Ryan, I have a question for you. What can you talk about in terms of the research that you have done when it comes to PPA procurement timelines and outdated grid infrastructure and supply chain materials, and how that really all plays into, the current data that you have?
Right. Well, we survey people all over the all over the world, really. So in every market, there's particular, challenges. It's certainly the case that where regulators are moving fastest, it opens up the market much quicker in terms of allowing the developers to move quickly, allowing the finance to be arranged quickly. So we've seen a lot of variability around that in just the last few years, which I think we saw reflected in that question around what are your most significant challenges? The most significant challenge, everybody said, number one challenge, global regulatory policy differences. So when they see a particular market either move very fast or very slow in that respect, it kind of reverberates through the business and creates challenges there. So I would say that's what we're seeing.
And
Sam, you
Jessica,
look like you wanted to say
I was
something.
gonna say I'm reading some of the questions which I hadn't had time to do while I was speaking. But there's an interesting one about what during a long-term contract, what some of our clients are doing. I think one of the more interesting things I'm seeing is standalone capacity and or agreements for, so excuse me, tolling agreements for standalone utility scale front of meter batteries. Thinking, oh, I have ERCOT exposure to solar. Solar is driving midday pricing down. My generation weighted revenues are decreasing from what I saw in 2022, 2023. 24 and 5 look very different for me. I think the introduction of large scale energy storage isn't just interesting for grid operators, but it can be very interesting for corporate off takers as a part of a portfolio approach as well. So I think that speaks specifically to one of the questions in the chat that I, like I said, just got around to reading. So thank you for dropping that in.
Yeah, no worries. Well, I know we went a little bit over the time that we had planned on going, but Ryan and Sam, thank you for all of the work that you put into today's event. Sam, it's always great to work with you and the team for Verse, and Ryan, it was great to get to know you a little bit this week. So we appreciate your time, and I know it's later in the day where you are right now in England. So thank you for spending time with us in the evening. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to answer them or ask them when we close up today's event. And don't forget that you will be getting a copy of the slide deck from the team at Verse. So thank you all for being on with us. And this concludes our webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica.